Hey, welcome. So today we're talking about foreign policy options or war-making options of the federal government. Um, and as I film this, we are in this nuclear confrontation between North Korea and the United States, and we're saying all of these things. And so we'll see if there's is there something that we could be doing in the foreign policy area that might help us in that situation, or even in the past or future situations. And so I just want to go through the different foreign policy options that a president has as he or she is thinking about what to do. And so let me take you through them. And I would suggest that you write some of these down, or you have that chart that I think that you have access to that you can fill out along the way as well. Certainly, a president can do nothing. Just kind of let things happen and see what happens. And sometimes this is the best choice. A strength of this is that nobody dies. At least no one dies of your actions. Yes, so you're not killing anyone, and you're not spending money and things like that. And the bad things with doing nothing is that nothing changes. And so if there's like a struggle or a conflict or something, you don't solve it. And there's always the chance of things will get worse if you just let things happen, kind of watch things happening, then maybe things will get worse, and then you have a bigger problem. The opposite of that is, all out war, send troops, send planes, send ships. Strength of this obviously is that something's going to change. It's not always a change for the better, but something's going to change. Whatever happens as a result of an all-out war, it will be different than from the beginning, usually. Obviously, weaknesses are people will die. And what happens in modern warfare is most of the people that die in wars today are not combatants, are not soldiers, but they're innocent people. Men, women, and children who are just in the wrong place at the wrong time or whatever. And so you must know that this is going to happen. There's no such thing as like a clean war, a war where nobody dies. So if you're going to send troops in an all-out war, people are going to die. And it's going to cost a lot of money. Military equipment is not cheap. What are some other things that you can do, though, between doing nothing and an all-out war? Well, you can place sanctions on a country. If you do this alone, they're called unilateral sanctions. If you do it with the rest of the world, it might be called multilateral sanctions. Those are probably the most effective, because if you do them by yourself, then there'll be ways around it, right? But if the whole world says we're going to put sanctions on North Korea, and we're not going to let them buy certain things, and we're not going to ship them oil, and we're not going to do all of these things to try to change their behavior, that might be effective. If you just do it by yourself, it's probably going to be ineffective. So some strength of sanctions: nobody dies. These are relatively inexpensive to enforce. Unless you have to enforce it, and this is one of the weaknesses, right? So you kind of have to enforce them for them to be effective. That could mean taking some military action to try to enforce them. But more or less, sanctions aren't very effective, certainly in the short term, of changing the behavior of a country. Maybe in the long term, but certainly not in the short term. And then another weakness that's not on here is that it affects you negatively, right? It affects your country negatively, because maybe you're not selling oil, or you're not selling certain products to them that you otherwise would have. You could go to the United Nations and pass a resolution. And again, the strengths of this: nobody dies. This is relatively inexperienced. We try to get the whole world involved. These are all good things. The weaknesses, though, of UN resolutions is that the United Nations has no power to enforce them. And so the people who have to enforce them might be a nation's military, or several nations' military, to try to enforce the resolutions. These are more or less symbolic, but there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being symbolic sometimes. So Now, there's an organization called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which is made up of mostly European countries and the United States. NATO has a military, and they have taken action in places like Bosnia and in Afghanistan. So NATO is an actionable organization. The United Nations really doesn't take any actions. They just kind of explain things and point things out. Well, NATO might actually do something. And so this is one of the strengths, right? That there can be some military action taken by NATO, and that there's over 20 countries as a part of NATO. And so if you take NATO action, it's not one country versus another country. It's more of a global, international thing. However, again, with any NATO military action, people are going to die. And so that's just like something that you have to be aware of and be okay with. NATO action can be expensive, again, by the missiles and the planes and all of that kind of stuff. And really, NATO really hasn't had a lot of success. I mean, they haven't used their military organization very much at all. The few times that it has, I mean, in Bosnia, it was pretty successful. And Afghanistan, it's been, 16 or 17 years that we've been in Afghanistan. And so certainly that's not evidence of success, but there hasn't been, terrorist action coming out of Afghanistan. So maybe it is a success. Who knows? You can sign a treaty. These are difficult to get, but like we know there's a treaty between the United States and Iran that the former president thought was fantastic. The current president doesn't like at all. And so these are hard to get, because when you negotiate with someone, you usually have to give up something to them to get something that you want back from them. And so these aren't perfect. You're not going to get exactly what you want, but you might get something. Some of the strengths from this is that they're peaceful. No one usually dies in treaty negotiations. And usually this is a positive thing, because people from both sides come to an agreement. And so you can move forward after that. Again, treaties are hard to enforce unless you're willing to actually enforce them and take action when one side or the other breaks the treaty. And because of that, a lot of times treaties are not effective if one side doesn't think the other side will enforce it. So that's a problem. One thing that the United States has done in the past is something called the no-fly zone, where they've been trying to protect a certain group of people, and they say that no one's allowed except for us to fly in this area. And therefore, groups of people can't be bombed or killed or all of those things. This is very limited, and so it does have a history of being effective. It has protected populations of people, so that's a strength. But some of the weaknesses, again, that people might die because if someone violates the no-fly zone, you kind of have to do something about it, or otherwise it's not really effective. And so you might have to shoot people down or whatever. This is expensive to fly jets around and helicopters to patrol the no-fly zone. But again, it might be something, if your goal is to protect a group of innocent people, this might be one way to do it. There's also this idea of covert secret action, right? The United States has had a history of this, and a lot of times that hasn't gone very well. Other times it has. We know with SEAL Team 6 and the capturing and killing of Osama bin Laden, that was a total covert action. But these are obviously very risky. Even with the capture of Osama bin Laden, one of our helicopters crashed in that process. If you remember from your history books, the Iranians held some Americans hostage in 1980. And we tried to rescue them, and the rescue planes crashed and all that. So the weaknesses of covert action is that they're highly risky, and people might die, and they might not be very effective. But then at the other side, one of the strengths is that if they do go well, they can be very effective and very inexpensive, because they're small little in and out actions that could capture exactly or do exactly what you want it to accomplish. One thing that also can be done is to build a coalition from around the world, right? And try to get as many countries as possible on your side, and to actually maybe, commit troops or commit something to be part of this coalition. So it's not just something in writing like what might happen at the United Nations. And so these are hard to put together. Probably the best example of this recently in recent history has been President George Herbert Walker Bush, the first President Bush in when he first went to war against Iraq in, I forget now what year it was, 91 maybe, when Iraq invaded the small country of Kuwait. And they put together a coalition of pretty much the whole world who sent troops and hospital ships and things. So what's nice about this is that you can get large numbers of stuff that you might need, and it's all voluntary, supposedly voluntary. So countries are doing this, because they think it's the right thing to do. These are hard to get though, because most countries don't like to get involved in things that don't affect them directly. So you might have to play a game of, listen, we'll get you this if you participate. And so it might not be voluntary. And that's what it says when people want something in return. So those are some of the foreign policy options that a president has. And who does he have to do this? Well, he has these groups. He has the State Department, which is like the diplomacy group. These are the people who try to talk it out. All of our embassies around the world are part of the State Department. So they try to talk out things before they get to a war. Obviously, we have the Department of Defense, which is housed in the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Actually, the Pentagon's in Virginia. But that's all of our military stuff is the Department of Defense. And then we have our secret organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, who might do some secret things that we don't know about. And so these are the 3 organizations or 4 organizations that the president has access to. Okay, so I hope this has given you some ideas of how the president conducts foreign policy. And then you have an assignment here that will ask you to kind of maybe think of a way that maybe you can encourage the president or advise the president about what to do in certain situations. So good luck with that. As always, email or text me any questions. And until next time, have a good one.